The slasher film is probably one of the most popular subgenres of horror out there, exploding in popularity in the late 70s and all through the 1980s and finding continued success in the decades that followed. It seems that if there's one thing horror movie lovers can't get enough of, it's watching evil villains slaughter innocent people left and right in rather gruesome ways. But that being said, despite coming to prominence only after the fall of the Hays Code, it might surprised many to learn that the basis for the slasher subgenre was around long before then, with perhaps the earliest example of a film with such a template going all the way back to 1932. And today, I'd like to go over the history of this movie and specifically why it's considered by most movie experts to be the first proto-slasher film. And there will be minor spoilers ahead, so in case you don't want anything about this movie ruined, you might just want to keep on the lookout. This will be the only spoiler warning I'll be giving out. Okay, so to get right into it, the movie in question here is the 1932 film 13 Women, based on the book of the same name, telling the story of a woman named Ursula Georgi who's determined to get revenge on a group of 13 sorority sisters who ruined her chances at getting ahead in college, and she won't settle for anything less than the total destruction of their minds or death. So to that end, she takes advantage of the fact that all 13 women sent letters to a fortune teller with a reputation for being particularly good at predicting events to deliberately send them false predictions foretelling their doom so that they'll subconsciously ensure that it comes to pass. But while at first this works like a charm, Ursula Georgi ends up meeting her match in Laurie Stanhope, who's both widowed and determined to keep her son safe at any cost. So setting her sights on the child, Ursula is willing to do whatever it takes to kill the boy in order to psychologically destroy his mother, and nothing is going to stop her from succeeding in that task. Now, with a plot like that, it's really easy to see why this is considered one of the first examples of a slasher film, as it not only features a very determined and unstoppable killer, but she also spills plenty of blood just in the first 5 minutes alone. But unlike most later slasher films, the movie really isn't about the murders themselves and focuses more on the efforts of one of her victims to stop her and save her son before it's too late. So as a result, many movie experts, which I'd like to stress I am not, have been hesitant to call it a horror movie and often label it as a psychological thriller, since it's more about the character's torment and the threat of what might happen rather than what's actually shown. There's even a particularly intense moment towards the end involving a bomb that was probably a major inspiration for the likes of Alfred Hitchcock, because if one doesn't know the outcome, it's just as agonizing and heart-pounding to sit through as it was in 1932. So whether or not it should be considered a thriller or a horror movie, the point is that it most definitely succeeds in scaring its audience. Though apart from that one scene, the scariest thing about this film may just be Myrna Loy's performance as the villainous Ursula Georgi. Because simply put, due to her odd appearance, Loy had been long typecast as villains at that point in her career, but this is easily her best performance playing such a character. She perfectly embodies the pure evil, revenge-minded mentality of her character with absolute ease, with just the mere look on her face telling the audience everything they need to know about this character. Seriously, a lot of stuff in this movie doesn't hold up, I'll say that right now, but Loy's performance is not one of them. And what only makes it worse is that she actually has a surprisingly sympathetic motivation behind her actions, and it's one that many are apt to sympathize with even more as time has gone on. Few would argue that it justifies the lengths she goes to get revenge, but especially for 1932, it's a very effective and nuanced look at why somebody would go to the lengths she does over a seemingly petty grudge. And once again, Myrna Loy's performance is right on the money here, perfectly conveying Ursula's sociopathic lust for revenge and her surprisingly human anger all in equal measure. But as I already touched on, despite having its moments, that's not to say this movie is perfect, particularly because it's only an hour in length, though it was originally an hour and 13 minutes before being cut down, explaining why a few things in it are a little confusing. Seriously, when it comes to simply understanding the story, the book presents it all a lot better. And not to mention, as a result, only 11 of the 13 women are depicted, with the other two only being mentioned since their scenes were deleted. So as I just noted, because of that, the movie doesn't make a ton of sense at certain points, and it's really an intense atmosphere and few legitimately scary moments that makes it at all memorable. But even then, even if one is willing to look past its somewhat confusing plot, there's also that it was made in 1932 and definitely shows its age. Because while I did argue that older horror movies could still be very scary in another video, which you can find a link in the description to, this one never really reaches the heights of those I mentioned in that video, due to both its somewhat confusing story and maybe focusing a little too much on the characters' fear and melodrama. Now, like I noted before, the fact that it's debated whether or not this was even intended to be a horror movie could help explain this. But even as a thriller, it only has moments of greatness. But nowadays would probably be viewed as boring, with the exception of those aforementioned moments. And indeed, pretty much the only reason anybody in the new millennium has heard of it is either because it featured early roles by actresses who would later go on to become famous, including the aforementioned Myrna Loy, or for featuring the only film performance by Peg Entwistle. And if you've never heard of her, she was the one who threw herself off the Hollywood sign and whose ghost is now rumored to haunt it. In fact, some even believe that what motivated her decision to jump was the fact that most of her scenes were axed when the movie was cut down, and that made her realize that her career prospects were basically doomed. But nonetheless, among film historians, it's still seen as one of the first examples of the slasher subgenre due to its premise, overall tone, and the depiction of the villain as an unstoppable force that can strike at any moment no matter the odds against her. And again, it most definitely shows its age and isn't all that scary, but it was definitely among the first films of its kind to depict such things, and especially the villain having a sympathetic backstory. Because while it's not a requirement of slasher films, a surprising amount of them do feature that to a degree, and it can be traced all the way back to here, when the genre was still in its infancy. So in the end, 13 Women is a pretty flawed movie that doesn't hold up that well to today's standards, apart from a few surprisingly tense and effective scares, as well as a fantastic performance by Myrna Loy. Seriously, I said it before and I'll say it again, but Ursula Georgi is a slasher villain that deserves to rank right up there with the best, despite predating the genre by decades. But regardless of all of that, the point is that its overall quality aside, pretty much the only thing everybody can agree on is that it's one of, if not the earliest example of the slasher movie on the big screen, and has a surprising amount of elements that would become staples of the genre further down the line in its narrative. Now again, whether or not it was even intended to be a horror movie is debatable, as well as how influential it really was on later slasher movies, as most feel it wasn't much. But it's still interesting to see how far the concept of such a story really goes back. Because even if the results weren't the best, it still lends the film some surprisingly scary and creepy moments, and in certain ways perfectly foreshadowed what the genre would go on to become in the decades that followed. Okay, I think that ends this little history lesson. So now I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. Did you have any idea that the concept of the slasher film went as far back as 1932? Or do you believe that 13 Women doesn't deserve to be considered an early example of the genre? Please feel free to let me know in the comments below. And please keep in mind that you do not have to agree with this video just because you watched it. You are entitled to your own opinion and can feel about this or any other topic we discuss here that you want to, and I nor anybody else can tell you you're wrong. And thank you all for watching. It is very appreciated. and I hope to see you all next time.